Thank you again for joining us this evening for Resistance in the Bluegrass, Empowering the Commonwealth. Farrah Alexander is a writer, author, and activist. Through activism and the notable wins and losses of the past several years, she became inspired by attorneys who so often were thrown into first responder roles, defending the rights of those in need. Believing law is an effective and direct way to enact the positive change that we wish to see. She began pursuing her JD at Indiana University and now is pursuing it transferred to the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. In her first year, she won the Indianapolis Bar Association's inaugural writing competition with an essay proposing a 3-point legislative plan to combat Indiana's maternal mortality rate. She also served as a student representative of the Jewish Faculty and Staff Council, a research assistant on the Law versus Anti-Semitism Conference, and became a founding member of the university's Jewish Law Student Association. Her editorial work has been featured in HuffPost, Bust, and Scary Mommy. She is the author of Raising the Resistance, A Mother's Guide to Practical Activism. Please join me in welcoming Farrah Alexander.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming and for being here. I really, really appreciate it. And I was absolutely delighted to be invited to the Filson Historical Society. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So I wrote this book, Resistance in the Bluegrass, Empowering the Commonwealth, and speak up a little bit. Okay, great. And my first book was quite a bit of my own experience, my own narrative. And this book was quite a bit different because I spoke to many activists across the Commonwealth and spoke to them about the different changes that they have made. And all these people were, all things considered, some pretty ordinary people who did extraordinary things and led to some big change. And so for this presentation, I thought I would just kind of take a look at some of the things that are in the book. So the table of contents, you can kind of see every chapter kind of stands on its own. You could read just one chapter and hear a couple stories about amazing Kentuckians. And so I had the pleasure of interviewing many of these Kentuckians. And originally in the book, we had planned on including some pictures, and book publishing is complicated. And in the end, I'm not very tech savvy and I was like, okay, no pictures. So the good thing is now we're here and you get to see the pictures that would have been in the book if perhaps I was more tech savvy or perhaps book publishing wasn't so complicated. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the stories in this chapter and talk about this, just take some little excerpts of some of these stories. So the first chapter is about poverty, and the quote that I had highlighted was from James Baldwin, which says that anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. And I think that was very appropriate for in Kentucky. Many communities throughout the Commonwealth struggle with poverty, whether it's in West Louisville or Eastern Kentucky, and they deal with it in different ways. And there are incredible activists who combat poverty through mutual aid models and starting new organizations and directly helping people in need. And so one of the people that I interviewed for this chapter is Taylor Ryan. Some of you may know her. She's a very young activist who created the nonprofit Change Today, Change Tomorrow, and they have done incredible work in a very short amount of time. And when I was interviewing her, one thing that kind of stuck with me was that she brought up joy. And that's not something that I often hear when people are talking about poverty. People typically associate poverty with despair and suffering. And I thought that was very unusual. So she said, there are people who are living in poverty, but they are happy, said Ryan. And I'm not going to take that joy away from them by calling them poor. When I asked Ryan to elaborate, she laughed and asked, say more about being poor and happy? Ryan approaches poverty as a systemic issue. It's statistics and numbers, but people are people. They're not just statistics and numbers, and they shouldn't be treated as if they were. When public assistance and charity serve the poor, there's often quite a bit of gatekeeping surrounding their needs and behavior. There's often criticism of what someone purchases at the grocery with an EBT card, formerly known as food stamps. People express the view that if a purchase is being made with an EBT card, they want to see a cart full of healthy food and shelf-stable items like beans, certainly not junk food like soda or chips, and certainly nothing lavish like steak. It seems only normal to have opinions about food that is not going home with you if there's public assistance involved. There are also often conditions for receiving aid. When Governor Matt Bevin was running for office, he suggested random drug tests be performed for recipients of public assistance. The welfare queen myth tells us that those depending on public assistance to survive are, first of all, almost always Black women with many children and are somehow taking advantage of the benefits and living lives of luxury. This stereotype has persisted for decades, with many citing it as an example of the dangers of public assistance. But as the myth has persisted, it seems that an ideal welfare recipient has also emerged. With all this policing of what is and isn't appropriate in terms of assistance, if assistance is needed, it must be temporary. The recipient must abstain from drugs, alcohol, and Cheetos. The recipient who is without a job must be actively looking for one. And joy is not in the equation. I have never heard someone in a nonprofit describe the people in need as joyous. I've never associated being poor with being happy. When we continue to gatekeep poverty and determine who is worthy and who is not, while meeting only their most basic needs and nothing more, if there's anything I'd associate with poverty, it would be suffering. After all, when people are enraged by the welfare queen stereotype, isn't it the joy of a poor Black woman they find most offensive? To call attention to the joy felt despite being poor seemed like a truly radical statement, not only in the nonprofit world, but in our capitalist society. The world doesn't think poor people should be happy, said Ryan. When you see us on trips, I know we went several days without eating to make that money happen. Sometimes we sacrifice a bill a couple months, and even if you see us getting the steak and shrimp in our baskets at Kroger, know that we're still swiping an EBT card. There are ways to be happy and still experience the aesthetics of this rich world. People are happy amid all this trauma. I picked up my boyfriend who works at the Parkland Boys and Girls Club, and there are shootings in Parkland almost every day. Not even a block away, I hear pop, pop, pop. Kids are literally skipping. While seeing joy, you hear trauma. Even amid trauma, there is joy. Amid poverty, there is joy. You just have to find it, seek it, hold on to it, and you have to build community around it. So I really liked that. I thought that was a really interesting perspective that we don't often hear. And I think it was a really necessary perspective. And so I like that. And that is Taylor Ryan. Okay. And so in the next chapter, I talked about environmental activism, and there were a few different people that I highlighted and causes, including Rubber Town. And one other person that I interviewed was Craig Williams, who is a veteran, and he was involved in the fight against the chemicals weapons destruction in Kentucky. And so a quote that I liked from him was that many serve in the military and learn to conform to authority, and Williams learned to question it. And that definitely was my experience speaking to Mr. Williams. And so an excerpt from that chapter is that environmental activists like Williams are not easily swayed by the claims of officials that incinerating the chemical weapons is perfectly safe. And given Williams' personal history and knowledge of the threats that environmental factors pose, it's not much of a surprise. In the United States, there have been many instances of the public being told a chemical exposure is safe, only to learn decades later it was not. Williams' distrust of authority first sparked as a young translator in Vietnam who came home and opposed the war. One of his first encounters with a hazardous chemical happened during his military service. Agent Orange was a tactical herbicide widely used by U.S. troops in Vietnam. Soldiers were told not to worry, and authority figures insisted that the chemical was harmless. However, Vietnam veterans are found to have a much higher rates of various types of cancer and skin, nerve, and respiratory disorders. Health hazards related to Agent Orange also included birth defects in children born after deployments. And the Agent Orange Act, which gave Vietnam's vets eligibility to receive compensation and treatment, wasn't enacted until the 1990s. And the battle to confirm the health effects of the chemical and to determine who is eligible for relief persisted for more than 4 decades. Now in his 70s, Craig Williams suffers from symptoms related to Agent Orange, like many other Vietnam veterans. When federal agencies claimed there weren't any health hazards related to incinerating chemical weapons near his family home, he was skeptical and chose to fight for a safer alternative. Williams' skepticism of the safety of chemical weapons incineration may well have been influenced by the cycle of officials claiming something was safe and then later conceding it was quite dangerous. You know the old adage, fool me once. And the next chapter, you recognize it. So you'll appreciate this. So actually one of my favorite chapters in this book is about religion and religious activism. And so one reason is because I am Jewish and Judaism is very much a part of my own activism, but also because as I was interviewing other people in the book, not about religion, suddenly they would talk about their own beliefs and how those beliefs have driven them to create positive change. And one of the people that I interviewed was Ira Grepper, and I luckily found this screenshot of him so you could actually see him, but I described him in the book and said, this guy wearing suspenders, thick glasses, and what appears to be orthopedic sneakers is a complete badass. And so that is him. And after I read this little expert, I think you will agree. So in an address prepared for the New Jewish Agenda Conference in 1991, Grepper recalled the experience, which he described to me as a profoundly religious one. We arrived in prison trucks at the state fairgrounds where cattle had been kept and then moved, and which were in the same buildings where we would be housed. Women and men were separated, and I didn't see my jailed sisters in the struggle until we were released on bond about 2 weeks later. After being booked, let me give you a little bit of background as I'm reading this. So Ira Grepper was very involved in the civil rights movements of the 1960s. And in this particular moment, he was protesting with a group of Black and white activists for civil rights with the Student Nonviolent Association. And they had been brutally beaten by police and had been arrested. And there were so many of them that they were actually being held in a state fairgrounds. So after being booked, we had to pass through a cordon of Mississippi State Police. Some of us were beaten. In the cavernous hall where we wound up, there were additional beatings for protesting the cops segregating us. Black civil rights protesters on one side facing whites on the other. When dinner was to be served, the guards, as a form of control and humiliation, forced the whites to line up first. Each white inmate was given a slice of bologna stuck between two stale pieces of bread and a paper cup with milk, or rather tepid water with a little bit of milk powder. Each white guy returned with his meal to a spot on the cement floor on the white side, sat down cross-legged, and placed the cup on the floor, sandwich on top of the cup in front of him. Then the brothers, the African-American civil rights prisoners, lined up to get their sandwich and milk. They returned to their spots on the colored side, sat down cross-legged, placing their cups on the hard cement floor and sandwich on top. There was no talking, no one ate, no one drank. After the last Black prisoner took his seat, all of us prisoners, white and Black together and without prearrangement, picked up our sandwiches and broke bread as one. As he told this story, which he's told many, many times over the past few decades, he suddenly got choked up reminiscing. He quickly wiped away a few tears. If I were a Catholic, I would have thought of the Holy Communion. It was that kind of solidarity that made such an impact. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I still remember that thing. Right. And on the next slide, this is one of the teachers who was protesting during the sick outs that you may remember. And you may also remember, if you were from Kentucky, that Matt Bevin was not very kind to the teachers. And largely as a result of that, Matt Bevin was not reelected. And Governor Andy Beshear, when he was inaugurated, said, "To our educators, this is your victory. Your courage to stand up and fight against all the bullying and name calling helped galvanize our entire state." Governor Andy Beshear. And in the fourth chapter, which is about education, then later in a debate, Bevin was asked about the accusations he had directed at teachers. His characterization of the teachers as throwing a temper tantrum and as being remarkably selfish and having a thug mentality had become infamous. When he was asked if he had regretted any of his cruel comments, he said, "I regret nothing that I have ever said about an educator. Nothing." Ouch. For teachers, Andy Beshear was the true antithesis to Bevin. He not only opposed the cuts they viewed as disastrous proposed by a governor that bullied them, but Beshear had also just seemed really nice and wholesome. As many Kentuckians learned from watching his daily 5 o'clock briefings, delivering the latest updates on the COVID-19 pandemic, he has a very calming and kind presence that almost reminds you of a younger Mr. Rogers with a slight twang. I'd bet he enjoys dad jokes and going to bed at 10. Then Beshear really sealed the deal with teachers by choosing Jacqueline Coleman, an educator, as his running mate. And so I thought that was a pretty good example of, here in Kentucky, you are probably familiar with this state of the General Assembly. We are a pretty red area, and yet the governor won largely from teachers who just wanted to do their jobs and get what was promised to them. And the next chapter goes into a little bit more of the state of the General Assembly. I see someone giggling over there. You like that? So this is a picture of Attica Scott, who many of you are probably familiar with. Abby's like, yeah, she is absolutely wonderful. And she also wrote the foreword for my book, and she did a fantastic job. And so one reason that Attica Scott is so incredible, and you probably do know her, is that she is pretty rare in the General Assembly. And so one way I described the Kentucky General Assembly is that the crowd at Cracker Barrel on a Sunday afternoon looks more diverse than the Kentucky General Assembly. And I like Cracker Barrel, and I would know. So I wrote, the Kentucky House and Senate are overwhelmingly Republican, holding massive power. The state Senate currently has, now this was a couple of years ago, but currently has 29 Republicans and 9 Democrats, while the state House has 75 Republicans, and only 25 Democrats. This majority has made it virtually impossible for the state Democrats to pass any remotely progressive bill, while some pretty asinine bills tend to skate through. Here's one example. In the aftermath of Breonna Taylor's killing, the people of Kentucky and much of the world demanded justice. Thus far, justice has not come in the form of any police officers involved in her killing being charged for her death. I did write this a couple years ago. Many activists and legal experts shifted strategy to focus on one factor related to her death: no-knock warrants. These warrants allow police officers to storm someone's residence unannounced and can cause confusing and dire consequences, as we've seen. A bill named Breonna's Law has been introduced in the Kentucky House, but so far it hasn't gained the traction necessary to move forward into law. Meanwhile, Republicans in the legislature have taken the opportunity to respond to Taylor's tragic death and the outrage expressed in Kentucky. In response, Republican Senator Danny Carroll, a retired police officer, examined the issues and thought to himself, I see the real problem here. People are saying mean things to cops. So Senator Carroll introduced a bill that designates insulting a police officer as disorderly conduct, a Class B misdemeanor. If someone specifically accosts, insults, taunts, or challenges a law enforcement officer with offensive words or gestures or other physical contact, that would have a direct tendency to provoke a violent response from the perspective of a reasonable and prudent person. Even if you are not a revered constitutional scholar, you might rightly have a concern that this bill might conflict with one of those big amendments. It's the first one. You may also be rightly worried that this reasonable and prudent people are too quick to turn to violence. It's offensive, it's absurd. It's not just an issue of not hearing the people, it's blatantly choosing to ignore them. The average Kentucky representative is a white, male, Christian, baby boomer, and is likely to be a business owner or attorney. The demographics of the General Assembly are 83% male, 17% female, 91% white, 5% Black, 92% Christian, 1% non-Christian. And yeah, so since this writing, it's actually gotten worse. I'm not pleased to report, but we have that. So another person that I really enjoyed learning more about, and many of you are probably familiar with her, is Anne Braden. And I was just really amazed by her story and the sacrifices that she was willing to make for racial justice, and to see so many activists on the ground today who had been directly trained by Anne Braden and were inspired by Anne Braden. I thought that was just really incredible and amazing to see what a legacy she has in this area. And this quote from her is actually from one of her books. And it says, either you find a way to oppose the evil, or the evil becomes part of you and you are part of it, and it winds itself around your soul like the arms of an octopus. If I did not oppose it, I was responsible for its sins. And so Anne Braden was an advocate of racial and economic equality for more than half of a century, and was one of the white Southerners singled out for praise by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his celebrated letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. And the Bradens, Anne and Carl, used the years that they expected to be behind bars to fully engage in civil rights advocacy. Carl died suddenly in the 70s, and Anne carried on their shared mission, earning a collection of mugshots protesting injustice as her short bob became gray and her glasses grew thicker. Attitudes within the fight for civil rights were rapidly changing as the arc of justice was bending ever so slightly, making more progress towards racial equity. Another picture that I really wish I could have squeezed in there was this incredible photo from Ryan Van Eltzer of WFPL. This was during the protest demanding justice for Breonna Taylor. And it's just a really incredible photo because you see many of the armed police, and right above there's Alberta's Louisville, if you're familiar with Alberta Jones. And so I wrote just a little bit about her for in case you're not familiar. So Alberta Jones was a brilliant attorney, passionate civil rights activist, and a trailblazing icon. She became one of the first Black women to pass the Kentucky bar. And during the height of the civil rights movement, Alberta protested segregation and racial injustice, marching in the streets of Louisville and participating in the March on Washington of 1963, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech to impassioned activists like Alberta. She strived to increase voter participation among the Black community, registering thousands, and to ensure Black voters were properly educated on what to do when they entered a voting booth. She rented voting machines and taught them how to properly use them. And after graduating near the top of her class at Howard University, Alberta returned home to Louisville to practice law. And she told the Courier-Journal in early 1965, "When I got home, a lot of people said, 'You've got 2 strikes against you. You're a woman and you're a Negro.' And she said, 'Yeah, but I've got 1 strike left, and I've seen people get home runs when all they got is 1 strike.'" So I loved that. I thought that was really inspiring. And another story I was very happy to have the opportunity to tell was about a family who were some of the plaintiffs in the Obergefell decision that allowed us to have marriage equality across the United States. And the quote that I pulled is from the Obergefell decision from Justice Kennedy that said, they ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right." And I am a second-year law student, and I have to tell you, court opinions are very dry and boring, and they don't read like this. So I really, really love that quote. It just actually gives me chills. It's like romantic. I'm just like, wow, Justice Kennedy, who knew? And so in the story, I said, "This love story is not the exciting tale that Nicholas Sparks might dream up, or that would inspire a romantic comedy with a script irresistible to Rachel McAdams. Even the people involved in the story admit that their family is just, well, as boring and ordinary as any other family. Like most How We Met stories, it includes a lovely couple who are very much in love, and like most How We Met stories, you've probably heard it before. Here it goes. The couple met at a bar. They were instantly smitten. Love at first sight, if you will. Months after the first meeting, they moved in together, unable to stand to be apart any longer. They knew they wanted to have children, and soon they had 3. They lived happily ever after, with a few hiccups along the way. The couple in this story, Paul Champion and Randy Johnson, instantly fell for each other and wanted to spend their lives together, be a family, and frankly, just have an ordinary, boring life like everyone else's, in which a couple is fortunate enough to grow old together, still as in love as the day they met. But they had to make a pit stop at the United States Supreme Court to make that dream a reality. And so I just really like that story because there's nothing extraordinary about their love story. It's quite boring. They just wanted a basic human right that many of us have. But because they were willing to step up along with many other plaintiffs, we had marriage equality, and it's really incredible. So another story that I really loved was interviewing Sister Petty Davis of the Derby City Sisters. Is anyone familiar with the Derby City Sisters? Well, I am delighted to educate you. So the Derby City Sisters are they describe themselves as a group of queer nuns who just spread joy. They are a nonprofit, and they do a great deal of charity work in the area, and they're very lovely. They do bingo every the first Sunday of every month, and it's great. So about them, I said they wear habits, lots of accessories, full face makeup, and hold their flowing dresses as they move around the room angelically. They're mesmerizing. And so Sister Petty Davis said, I joined the sisters for a new social group and because I like to do charity work. But it turned out that when I learned more about our core missions, which are to spread joy and eliminate systemic guilt, I realized that to fulfill those vows, I needed to find more joy in my own life. I started looking for things that made me feel joyful and openly acknowledging them. This didn't just make me a better sister, it improved my life drastically. Manifesting joy in my life made me so much happier and able to spread joy. That is what I love most about being a sister. Okay, and in the next chapter was about immigration justice. And this image is Jesus Obenez, who graduated from the U of L's Brandeis School of Law. And when he graduated, he held this sign, which if you know Spanish, you might know what it means. But yeah, and so one thing that they did a lot was make people uncomfortable and demand justice anyway, in a really bold way. And I thought this picture was a very good example of that. And one thing I said about immigration was, for anyone challenging the idea that diversity is not our strength, I must remind you that not long ago, our taco options were limited to tumbleweed or Taco Bell. And now you can get authentic Mexican food in Hazard between the flea market and the Tractor Supply. And in the last chapter, I spoke about feminism and reproductive justice. And I actually wrote this prior to the passing of Bell Hooks. And ironically, I went right back to this after she did pass because I thought it was so profound, because it happened to be about why, after having such an incredible life and traveling all over the United States and writing such amazing work that has changed feminism for everyone, she wanted to come right back here to Kentucky. And specifically, she wanted to come back to Kentucky, and she was content with dying in Kentucky. And she wrote about that with Wendell Berry. So her identity and Kentucky heritage enlightened the feminist thought she pioneered, which feels much more relevant than ever in the wake of her death in late 2021. After she decided to move back to Kentucky, she published Belonging, A Culture of Place, which included conversation with fellow Kentucky writer Wendell Berry. Here's a bit from the chapter, Kentucky is My Fate. If one has chosen to live mindfully, then choosing a place to die is as vital as choosing where and how to live. Choosing to return to the land and landscape of my childhood, the world of my Kentucky upbringing, I am comforted by the knowledge that I could die here. This is the way I imagine the end. I close my eyes and see hands holding a Chinese red lacquer bowl, walking to the top of the Kentucky hill I call my own, scattering my remains as though they are seed and not ash, a burnt offering on solid ground, vulnerable to the wind and rain, all that is left of my body gone. My being shifted, passed away, moving forward on and into eternity. I imagine this farewell scene and it solaces me. Kentucky hills were where my life began. They represent the place of promise and possibility and the location of all my terrors, the monsters that follow me and haunt my dreams. Freely roaming Kentucky hills in childhood, running from snakes and all forbidden outside terrors, both real and imaginary. I learned to be safe in the knowledge that facing what I fear and moving beyond it will keep me secure. With this knowledge, I nurtured a sublime trust in the power of nature to seduce, excite, delight, and solace. And so that's it. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Scott, do you want me over here?
Yes.
All right. First, I want to thank you for ending with bell hooks.
Oh, thank you.
I knew her as Gloria Watkins. We went to high school together,
Oh.
and she was a year behind me.
Wow.
And one of my closest friends in high school.
Oh, my goodness.
We were on a number of student body issues, and
Wow.
she was a force for good even back then.
Oh, that's
Um, I do need to read something that we open our presentations with, and I forgot to do it, but
that's okay.
this is a marvelous illustration of what we do with public history at the Filson. And this was on the screens for the people zooming in, but history is not neutral. The programs presented at the Filson are interpretations of the past, created from imperfect, incomplete, and occasionally biased archives and created by historians who bring their individual life histories and perspectives to bear on the stories they share. The topics of Filson presentations are often difficult and frequently resonate with issues facing us today. This is by design. We have invited our presenters to engage honestly, critically, and respectfully with sometimes uncomfortable topics, and we encourage our audiences to do the same. So join us in that spirit of collective exploration, learning, and growth that has animated the Filson for over 130 years. And I think that what you've done tonight with us is quite illustrative of what we as an institution that has to publicly remain neutral can do to bring about important community conversations. So I'm going to open with a question after that long kind of thing. And let me get
Okay, sure.
This is the book. It's published by University Press of Kentucky, which is quite an honor in and of itself.
Oh, thank you.
Is it arranged? And I was wondering this as you were talking. It's arranged by topic, but does each chapter then focus on one individual on that particular topic? How did you arrange it?
Yeah, so each chapter, like I said earlier, kind of stands on its own. Theoretically, you could just pick up the book, read one chapter, and never read anything like right from the middle, and it would make perfect sense. I typically interviewed several individuals, maybe about 3. It kind of just depended on the topic and how engaged people in Kentucky have been on that particular topic. I think very easily I could have written a book on any one of these topics because there are so many incredible people in Kentucky. I think more than anything, after writing this book, I have become fiercely defensive of the people of Kentucky. I think when people face so much resistance to their own advocacy and their own ideas, they are so much more passionate and so much more incredible. And those are the people we have in Kentucky. So I had plenty of material.
Are there questions from the audience that you would like to ask? If so, come up here and just speak into the microphone so the people watching by Zoom can hear. And feel free. I want everyone to feel comfortable just to ask questions.
I just wanted to know, what do you think is the unique contribution of people from Kentucky to social justice?
That's a great question. I think there are so many different contributions, it's difficult to pinpoint. I think initially, before I wrote this book and before I spoke to so many people in Kentucky, for example, I shamefully didn't know that much about Anne Braden. And so I learned a lot from writing this book and learning about some of these incredible people. And so before writing this book, I probably would have said the Obergefell decision, because that is something that completely changed the landscape of the United States. And many of the people involved in that were people just like the couple from Kentucky, and attorneys from Kentucky who just believed in the radical idea that people have a right to marry who they love and want to. And but after speaking to so many people, I think that there's so much change that happens that many of us don't see, such as the mutual aid models in Eastern Kentucky, that it wasn't just when a natural disaster happens. There were mutual aid networks that exist in Eastern Kentucky that have always, or at least for many years, existed to simply just help their neighbors directly. And so now I think more of stories like that, and the stories that all throughout the Commonwealth, change is being made and people are doing extraordinary things to help their neighbors.
Thank you.
I've got one for you.
Okay, great.
The law degree that you're pursuing, what do you want to do with it?
Oh, great question. So yeah,
Your questioner is someone who practiced 42 years.
you know, I
But
feel so happy.
I have to tell you that I did general corporate litigation and social justice. Lamentably was not what I got to do those years.
Right.
Go ahead.
I completely understand that. Yeah, so I decided to pursue law because I was involved in various degrees of activism. And definitely after 2016, I saw attorneys just constantly springing into action and basically responding to emergencies. So when the Muslim ban came through, there were attorneys who went to the airports all over and were filing motions on airport floors. And I thought that was incredible. And I really wanted to be a part of that. And then also in the Obergefell decision, I saw that there were many attorneys who were relatively normal people who made this happen. And I was very inspired by that as well. One of them is a friend of mine, Dan Cannon, who I also interviewed in this book. And so I was very inspired by him. And I also felt in other areas of activism, I might, for example, receive some policy updates from attorneys. For example, I do a lot of work preventing gun violence, and work with Everytown for gun safety. And we would hear the attorneys talking about like suing gun manufacturers. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool. I can just tweet. And so I wanted to do more than tweet. I felt like the law was the most direct and positive way to enact change. And so I went for it. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm very interested in civil rights litigation. Last summer, I was able to work at the ACLU of Kentucky, which I absolutely loved. And that was also the summer of the Dobbs decision. And so the ACLU of Kentucky was very, very busy. But it was an incredible experience to learn and learn from these incredible litigators. And I was very inspired by that as well.
In your book, were you able to get over into Eastern Kentucky and talk about perhaps someone like John Rosenberg, who was the head of Apple Red?
Yes.
It was in Lexington.
Yes, I did. And I spoke to John over the summer. He was not in the book, but I interviewed Ben Carter with Kentucky Equal Justice Center, and he spoke of John quite a bit. And one thing that Ben Carter does is he's an attorney who works with the Kentucky Equal Justice Center to help people in poverty. And I've talked a little bit about that and the people affected. And that was really seeing like John Rosenberg's legacy and how people continue to be helped by him.
Abby?
Oh, hey, Abby.
Thank you so much, Farrah. I'm trying to figure out how to squinch this into a question. I think it's a question about fear and backlash and how people kind of continue to find the energy and the courage to push forward with their causes, even as they're meeting resistance that can take anything from the form of being shunned or silenced to, as Ira Grouper talked about, being physically beaten. And of course, Alberta Jones paid the most, horrific price because she was murdered. So what are some reflections that you have from, your experiences and from writing this book and talking to people? I mean, how do people absorb this kind of obstacle and pushback and find a way to keep going? Because it's not easy to do this work. Like, it's emotionally not easy.
Yes, you are absolutely right. And that is a question that I continue to struggle with. I think it's very difficult. So sometimes I feel very inspired by the story of Anne Braden, for example. That was someone who believed deeply in a cause and was willing to sacrifice for it and faced tremendous sacrifice for that. And I know there are many activists in Kentucky who have also had incredible sacrifices, and there is a threat to the safety of activists, and that's very serious. And I think that people need to just assess their own risk, I suppose, and protect their peace, whatever that means for them. When the protests were happening, demanding justice for Breonna Taylor, we were also in the middle of a pandemic. I participated in those protests, and when I spoke about them, I spoke about the precautions that were being taken to protect everyone from COVID-19. And I also mentioned no judgment. If you're not in the streets right now, that's understandable. You can support the cause in many different ways, and many people did. Many people helped donate to bail funds and talked to their neighbors and made change in their own ways. And I think that is fantastic and perfectly valid. You don't have to grab a megaphone and go out to the streets because you want to make positive change. You can make it in your own way. And I think, again, this is something that I struggle with. I don't have the perfect answer, but one way that I have come to think about social justice is that it's not something that we're going to fix and be done with it. So I went to the Kentucky Book Festival in Lexington, and I spoke to many people who came up and they kind of got a sense of like what the book was like. And they were several decades older than myself. And they're like, I lived through civil rights and we fixed it. And like, yes, you're welcome. And I'm like, oh, that's great. Unfortunately, like there's still problems. And so I've kind of come to approach social justice as we are never going to reach this utopian state of we have fixed everything. There is no white supremacy. There is no hatred. We are all equal and everything is fantastic. What I have come to approach it as is more like housework. So like I will clean my kitchen, and especially because I have 2 small children and a husband, it will be messy again very, very shortly. So I always do housework. Housework is something that you do continuously. And so I have begun to approach social justice in the same way, that this is something that we're going to do forever. And we're probably not going to fix everything, but hopefully we can make progress and get a little bit further. And so that has become my goal.
What is it about the history of this state where the motto is united we stand, divided we fall? Where this theme of resistance historically arises not only from what you've termed the social justice perspective, but what someone might term at the opposite end of the political spectrum as social injustice, that they might feel that their social justice is different from yours. What is it about this state that makes people feel so strongly about their opinions? And how do you reach out to the other side in a way that would embrace them and cause dialogue?
That's a great question, and a very difficult one. I think when I think about people throughout the Commonwealth, there's people to whatever degree they have experienced some type of injustice. And it may be that once where they lived, their grandfather had a wonderful job and their father had a wonderful job and they started to have a wonderful job, and then that job was taken away and now they live in extreme poverty. And that's the story of many people throughout Kentucky. And I think there's many people throughout the Commonwealth that feel powerless and are often overlooked. And they're overlooked across the political spectrum. So there are many, many communities where Democrats do not go, Republicans do not go. That has been different in the past couple of years, when there would be certain areas that Charles Booker and Attica Scott went, but that was it. And so these people, I think, are not feeling heard, and rightfully. And I think they want to be heard, just like so many of us do. Anyone who's experienced some level of injustice wants it to get better. And so I think that's part of it.
And then finally, the history of, I'll call it progressivism in the state, is profound. And I think that is what your book embraces and is about. What are the causes in this state, or the underlying historical reasons why we have this deep strain of progressivism in quite a conservative state? Would you say it's the Courier Journal or local newspapers like the Mountain Eagle, or colleges and universities like U of L or UK or Center or Transylvania or Berea?
Well, I think depending on the people in the community, it could potentially be all of those things or some of those things. I think that so many Kentuckians, they just have like this unparalleled passion, and that is very unique. And for many of them, I feel like I hear stories of they got it from their grandmother, who was incredibly impassioned and instilled a strength in them to stand up for themselves. And so I think it's very unique. I think some people probably are influenced by some of the wonderful universities and art communities that we have throughout Kentucky. I think many Kentuckians are positively affected by other people. I personally said several times that I felt inspired by either people I interviewed or other people that I mentioned. And I think that's the case for many people in Kentucky. There are the activists of previous decades have left legacies that now they're just like we talked about Mr. Rosenberg, and then I mentioned Ben Carter. So it's kind of like, generations later, we have basically like these super fans who were so greatly inspired by these activists and are continuing their legacies. And that's happening all over the Commonwealth. And it's really incredible. And I feel like that's the biggest factor.
Farrah Alexander, I'd like to thank you for a thought-provoking and interesting lecture. Glad you
Thank
came.
so much. Thank you all so much.